Lucy Letby provably saved the lives of babies at the Countess of Chester Hospital. If you'd said that sentence a few years ago, it would have seemed highly controversial. Today, it's significantly less controversial as the conviction of Lucy Letby continues to crumble, evidentially, medically, and intellectually. All that remains now is for it to crumble in the courts. In this video, we're going to examine the evidence which points to the fact that Lucy provably saved the lives of babies. So I'm going to begin this video by examining a Guardian article from 2018, which was published at the time that Lucy Letby was first arrested. As we know, the police, while they didn't actively identify Lucy Letby, they made it possible to identify her, which meant that she was splashed all over the media. At this time, Kate Walker, whose infant had been cared for by Lucy at the Countess of Chester, spoke to the Guardian, and I'm going to read the section in which Kate is quoted. Kate Walker from Chester, whose baby had been cared for by Letby, said she had been rather shocked when she saw that the nurse had been arrested. Walker's son was born prematurely at 27 weeks in February 2013. He spent a month in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester. The 36-year-old finance worker said, "We were in the neonatal unit for a month before we were moved to Alder Hey, and it was actually Lucy who pushed for it to be transferred because he was still very ill and she didn't want him to be discharged." So let's just reflect on that for a second before we go any further. So Lucy has pushed for the infant to be transferred to a tertiary unit because the child is still ill and she can see this child needs the best treatment possible. Now, of course, that immediately is not consistent with a serial killer, but then also, in addition to that, there would have been pressure to keep that infant at the Countess of Chester. If you've heard the interviews that I've done with Professor John Ashton, he explains why, and many others will explain why as well. So there is, and there would have been, a pressure to keep that infant on the unit, and yet Lucy has seen this infant needs to be treated at Alder Hey, and she has pushed, in Kate Walker's own words, for this infant to be transferred because she knows this infant needs the best treatment possible. So the article continues. "The whole time I was there, I can't fault them. They were busy, you couldn't have long conversations with them or anything, but I can't fault the treatment of myself or my son. Walker's son, who is now 5, was on a ventilator and needed round-the-clock care after his lungs collapsed and his heart rate dropped. I can't say anything negative about her," Walker said. "She supported me and she pushed for him to be transferred and only discharged when he was better. She told me every step of the way what was happening. I couldn't be at the hospital 24/7 because I also had a 20-month-old daughter at home, but I never felt like I couldn't trust them." Walker said she was grateful to Letby, a University of Chester graduate, for getting her son transferred to Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool for further treatment. She said, "I was rather shocked when I saw her picture. My son could have had more complications if it wasn't for her pushing for him to be sent to Alder Hey. So I'm grateful for that. And he is now a thriving 5-year-old and he has got no lasting damage. He hasn't had any trouble since he came out." So this essentially is a first instance from 2018 of Lucy Letby provably saving a baby. It's quite possible if this infant had stayed at the Countess of Chester that the infant wouldn't recovered. We know that. We know the gulf in treatment between Alder Hey and the Countess of Chester. We know that infants recovered when they were sent to other hospitals. We know that infants frequently deteriorated, unfortunately, at the Countess of Chester. So we're going to hear Kate's account amplified and facsimiled by other accounts of other parents in this video. I also wanted to reflect finally on this report by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, which is mentioned here in this report. Just mentions a couple of things, but we all know about the RCPCH report by now, and the observations made here are going to become more relevant as we continue with this video. So now we're going to move on to comments made in the Amanda Knox Doubt podcast, which is on the Lucy Letby case as a whole. These comments were made by Carl and Claire, who were parents of an infant, Jessica, who was treated at the Countess of Chester Hospital on the neonatal unit in the indictment period that became associated with the trial of Lucy Letby. So I'm going to go over the comments that were made in the Amanda Knox documentary and podcast. I think these don't require an enormous amount of commentary, but if I feel it's necessary, then I'll comment as needed. So this begins with Claire of the couple speaking here. So when the nurse looked at her, meaning Jessica, because she was wrapped up so well, she just saw her nostrils really flaring and said, "Sorry, just took her off call." Then a guy came in and said, "Here's a picture of her. You can see her shortly after recovery." Obviously, I was in a wheelchair and I went in to see her, and she was lying on her front with her bum in the air. She had a big mask on her face, a breathing mask, loads of wires. I said to the nurse, should she be lying on her front? And they were like, "She's fine, she's monitored up to everything." They said she was okay, she just can't get big breaths in, and it was actually Lucy that said that to us. She explained what was going on. So, as you can see, this was a challenging situation, probably quite a traumatic situation, and Lucy actually tries to calm the parents and say, this is the situation, this is what is occurring. So there's a bit of commentary here from Amanda Knox where she says Carl, Claire's husband, also recalls Lucy on the neonatal ward, and then Carl says the following. Lucy was very serious, very quiet, just quietly doing what she needed to do. It looked like she was taking stats, so she was looking at the monitor, writing things down, and then she spoke to us briefly. Then she went on. I think she went to another baby in the corner, and then off out of the room. She came out of the NICU to come up and sit with us, so she delivered that to us, and that was a very short, quick interaction as well. She's just, here's your baby kind of thing, she's all yours. My experience was very different from my wife's, you see. It was a very traumatic time for Claire, but for me, it was like one of the best times of my life because my daughter's coming into the world, and I thought everything was okay. So that week and a half for me were really just filled with, I can't wait to get her home and make sure Claire was recovering quickly. So again, just a short recollection of Lucy being very professional in her conduct. Then Amanda Knox introduces a question to Claire. Did you have any particular feelings about Lucy Letby at the time when you heard about all of this? And Claire said, at the time I was like, first I thought I couldn't believe it because they were so busy. Where would they find the time? They were always together. There were always two nurses. So I was like, how on earth could that have possibly happened? I don't know. Because literally they were everywhere. They were just nurses together, just flip to different things. So this is something we've questioned many times. It's something we've discussed many times. The logistics of these attacks are ridiculous. They're completely implausible. And not only that the attacks have been conducted, but no one suspected a thing among the nursing staff. So then Claire continues. Then I was obviously concerned that something could have happened to Jessica, and I wanted to know why. But the only interaction I had with her firstly was that very first time when she said, this is what we've done to her, and bringing her back to our room. So again, they're talking about Lucy and just being kind of calm and professional. So then there's another bit here with Amanda Knox doing a little introduction. The police eventually came back to the couple having gone through Jessica's file. They say there is no need for further investigation. Jessica will not be a part of the case against Lucy Letby. At the same time, they learned that the woman who was accused of being a serial killer of babies had complete access and control over the health of their newborn. And then we see Claire responding to these comments and responding to what occurred with the police. And he was like, oh yeah, quite blasé about it. They said, oh, I know all the things in the media at the moment about certain staff members, but she was her lead nurse, and she went through all the right procedures to get help. So I sat there and I was like, wait, you're telling me that the person in the media, Lucy Letby, was Jessica's lead nurse, and twice she had to call for help because she was going to die unless someone came to help. So she went through all the correct procedures, called the right people, did the right thing twice over 2 days. So again, this is just Claire recounting how Lucy was very professional, did everything correct, was surprised to hear that Lucy had been in the media, couldn't really believe it based on their experience with Lucy. So then Carl says, the revelation that this so-called serial killer had saved our child's life twice like an angel without our knowledge, never asking or telling us that she'd done it. She wasn't like, look at me, I'm the greatest nurse in the world. She didn't even tell us that she was their lead nurse. She just got on and did her job to the best of her ability. and now I have my daughter because of her. So this just doesn't make sense, you know. Whenever we talk about any part of this, it always goes back to the same question. It just doesn't make logical sense, and when things don't make sense, there's usually either missing information or somebody's telling lies, one or the other. So I'll leave people to reflect on that final sentence and what has actually occurred here. But clearly, both Carl and Claire were asking and are asking serious questions about what has occurred with Lucy, because she has saved their daughter, not once, but twice. And then Claire kind of reflects on this as well. How is it possible that she's been accused of randomly going around these babies, but then she sees my baby and does everything else she should from being trained for? I saved her twice. She didn't do that, Jess couldn't be here. If she didn't do that, Jess couldn't be here, you know. She could have said she's done nothing and let nature take its course, but she didn't. She saved her twice. It's so hard to get my head around, because it's like she was accused of being the serial killer, and I was like, wow, there she is, she saved my daughter's life twice. So Claire obviously knows this doesn't add up, and is obviously asking very serious questions about what has been reported, and indeed about the whole indictment against Lucy Letby. So then Claire continues, I asked her, please, why do you think she left Jessica alone if she did do stuff? And she said lack of opportunity. And I said lack of opportunity, but she saved her life twice. That's a perfect opportunity right there if she wanted, but she didn't. She saved her twice. And apparently Carl said he remembered the second intervention. Lucy actually did something to Jessica to help her before the consultant came in. So she more than just did the procedure, she did something to actively help save her. I couldn't get that around my head as lack of opportunity, because no, that's not an answer. So very little I can add to that. I mean, obviously, what she's saying there makes perfect sense and indicates that Lucy proactively saved the infant. And then Carl concludes here, I've got this idea that this potential serial killer has saved my child. I'd say I'm over 90% sure that they've blamed bad management and bad procedures and badly run units on one individual. They've seen an opportunity to scapegoat somebody. I don't believe for 1 minute that there's an individual out there who's capable of murdering one baby and then passing up on the opportunity to murder another. Twice. Maybe people can be that crazy. I don't know. I hope not. But it doesn't make any sense to me. I'd love to just sit down with Lucy and say, look, what happened that day? Why did you do what you did? And why didn't you have to if that's what you did? I've said this to myself. The only person that can add to that question for us is Lucy. If she's guilty, and if she's not guilty, then I don't believe a word that came out of the hospital's mouth anyway. So obviously, I think it's fair to say that Carl now is pretty damn certain that what he was over 90% certain about before, he's now probably 99.9% certain about. But yeah, this is just a series of comments from two parents who saw Lucy behave in impeccable fashion towards their infant and saved the infant's life twice. This is following on the back of what we've already heard from Kate Walker. This nurse who was given exemplary care on the unit is also supposed to have deliberately harmed babies. I have also been fortunate enough to interview Carl myself, and during that interview he recounted his experience with Lucy.
So the last question I want to ask you in this bit is about Lucy actually saving the life of Jessica. So when did you realise that had happened, and can you explain a bit more about that, please?
Well, the two collapses, now, just to be clear on this point, the pale moments and the two collapse moments are separate incidents. The pale moments were due to reflux and Jessica holding her breath. Again, we only later found this out at the meeting. The collapses she'd had, we weren't aware of at the time we were at the hospital. We only found out about them at the meeting. And these were two separate events within the first 24 hours of her life. And it happened in the small hours of the evening. We're not sure at what point. But once we get our full notes, we'll know. Now, what happened at that meeting, you see, is Brewery came along with a sheet of paper, which he'd obviously made a compilation of important notes, not the full notes, a compilation of the important points, so that he could read it out to us, not necessarily so he could hand it to us. We did grab a copy of that as we left, but I don't think he'd brought it to give to us. I think it was for his own, reference.
Hmm.
Now, we just basically we started I have to be clear about this point as well, is that I'm usually a very nice, calm, well-mannered person. By the time we sat in that meeting, I was very annoyed, and when I walked in that room, and I was kind of angry. And before I'd even sat down or greeted anybody, I just pointed at both of them and I said, "Were either of you two involved in any of Jess's care directly on anything that happened to her?" And they both panicked. And I can understand why. I'm a reasonably imposing guy in person. If I'd been in their shoes and a father had come in with that sort of attitude, I would have panicked too, to be fair. Now, they both panicked and said it was nothing to do with us. And I think Kilroy was the gentleman, not Chambers, that we met, along with Brewery. This Kilroy said, I wasn't even here. Now, I took that to mean that he was in a new position. Now it appears that he was, or not brand new, but he was new to this role. So he was kind of telling me the truth there. But then, so that kind of set the tone for the rest of the meeting, you see. So Brewery closed up and would only give one-word answers, and he wouldn't even look at us directly. He just kept looking down at his notes and trying to answer the questions we had. But then Kilroy, if that is who the gentleman was, he was in effect what I'd call a car salesman. He was trying to steer the conversation away from questioning what had happened to Jessica and more towards how lucky we were and how well she's doing today. So there was lots of questions. We'd ask a medical question, for example. Brady would attempt to answer it. This other gentleman would interject and with an unrelated question like, "How's Jessica getting on at school? How is she doing with this? How is she doing with that?" Stupid questions. Unrelated completely to what was going on and what we were asking. So it felt like he'd been brought in specifically just to try and smooth everything over and make sure we didn't walk away wanting to sue the hospital. Brewery, on the other hand, he seemed like he was just trying to give us the least amount of information he could without us suing them. He was the one who told us that she'd had the 2 collapses, and he was the one who told us that Lucy had acted to save it on both occasions. And he made the point that on the second occasion, she'd gone above and beyond the usual in her actions. What that meant, I don't know. Again, until we have the notes, we won't know exactly what was done and what wasn't done. Now, it might be the case that it was Lucy that intubated her, for example, and that intervention saved Jessica's life in that particular case. I don't know until I get the notes. He did not go into detail. What was very clear, though, is that he was adamant that not only had Lucy cared for our baby well, but without Lucy, we would have lost her. We didn't use that word specifically. But that was the intimation and certainly the drive of the conversation.
So
that revelation alone at that point was enough for us really to be so gobsmacked that we kind of lost our train of thought as far as all the other questions we wanted to ask when we got in there. And the questions turned to, how are you sure of that? How can you be sure that she wasn't hurting her and then saving her? All the questions that obviously pop up as soon as you hear something like that. And so he showed us on the notes, showed us what he had and what the time she'd interjected and what have you. So we were really again, we walked out of that meeting and the first feeling was, we are so lucky. And we've kind of got the answers we wanted, but we hadn't got the answers we wanted really. And over the next few days, as we thought about the things that they'd said and it all settled in, we realized that, in effect, we'd been fed a half-truth. They told us some of what had happened, but not all. And that they, for obvious reasons, weren't going to go into too much detail about what was going on in that unit, because at that point, it was still a live case. So when we went in to meet them, we couldn't, ask them any details about any of the babies. Not that we would have asked anyway, but they couldn't have shared that type of information with us. But that's not what we went in for. We just went in to see what had happened to Jessica. And as I say, I mean, this is one of the things that stands out to me as well, is we saw Lucy a number of times, including when she delivered it to the ward tours. There was a number of opportunities there where Lucy could quite easily have told us what she did and when she did it and why, and the fact that she'd saved our child and been lauded and thanked and praised for us for that. Now, there's a lot of accusations of that she was doing it for that type of adulation, that she would deliberately harm a baby and then bring them back and then enjoy the kudos for that. Now, I believe that would be, directed towards maybe a consultant or other colleagues and people like that, not necessarily the parents. But if you were that way inclined, you would look for adulation and praise from anywhere you could bloody get it. So yeah, the primary guy or girl you want to impress is a consultant, but you're also going to take it off the parents as well, and you're going to take it a bit off your colleagues and everybody else because look at how great I am. If that was her motivation, you'd get that off everybody you bloody could. So why would she not mention to us what she'd done? Why not tell us, I rescued your baby last night, if that was her motivation? Again, it's a little thing, and it's just my observation. But when you put all these things together, it makes for one hell of a stink. That does make sense, The thing I'm hoping as well, you see, and this is not to do with Lucy necessarily, is the more parents we speak to, the more thing that is really obvious is the majority of people that work there don't care about the people who are looking after, or at least they don't feel that they need to be honest and open with them, and they don't owe them anything or any explanation. It's kind of like a looking down the nose feeling that many families are getting when they're trying to get answers out of these people or they're trying to find information out.
So just to finally summarize this section, would it be fair to say that you, after hearing all this information, we're going to get into that further in the next kind of episode of our discussion. But after hearing all this information, after observing Lucy, after meeting Lucy, after understanding that she saved your baby's life twice, after seeing the medical notes that prove this, after speaking with consultants, after speaking with executives at the hospital, your impression of Lucy was that she was a competent, dedicated nurse who was just matter of fact about it and was just doing her job. Is that a fair summation?
That is a fair summation for sure. And I'd go a little bit further and say that out of everybody that we interacted with in the hospital, she was the only one that actually seemed to care about us as well as the baby. She was the only one who realised that the parents are going through something as well and deserve an explanation. And we didn't have to hound her for it. She volunteered that up to us when we came in to see Jessica for the first time on the unit. Very much what you'd expect from a lead nurse, somebody who's going to, take charge and speak to the parents and inform them what they've done and keep them in the loop. What you'd hope all nurses in these situations would be like. I don't think she's extraordinary in that regard. I think she's an example of what the majority of nurses are like in these units up and down the country. Hardworking, conscientious people who want to do the best they can for their patients. That was our impression of her, and it still is how we feel about it, because I'm yet to see anything that would convince me otherwise, personally.
So then, on top of what we've discussed already, another important aspect of the whole picture at the Countess of Chester that becomes evident from the court case is that Lucy Letby is frequently the first responder to alarms and also raises alarms on multiple occasions. So I'm going to go over a few examples of her raising the alarm that are not contested by the prosecution. So here we have child B's alarm sounding and Lucy had called the nurse to the child's incubator. This is another one where Lucy calls for help. This is in relation to one of the collapses of child G. Then there's another example where Lucy discovers desaturation and calls for help. This is a different collapse related to child G again. And then this is in relation to child N. Lucy goes straight over to this infant and notes that the infant was a bluish colour and called for help. We'll be talking about discoloration in just a few minutes. Then in relation to child O, Lucy calls for help and assistance in relation to this infant that was suffering his first collapse at the time. Then this is in relation to child D. Someone states that Lucy Letby was the person who called for help with this infant. Dr. Andrew Brunton was around at the time. Then this is yet another incident with child G where Lucy calls out for help. This is acknowledged by multiple people. And then this is a written note from Lucy indicating that she called for help after child O desaturated again. So this is another collapse of child O. Then a nurse recounts Lucy having asked for help in relation to child A, the twin of child B. This is another one where a nurse recounts that she heard Lucy shouting for help in relation to child G. And then there are two nurses present here for child I, Lucy and Ashley Hudson, both of whom shouted for help from colleagues. And then we also see Lucy arriving in response here to a call for help. So when there are calls for help with child I, Lucy's the first responder. And then, of course, infamously, there's this email from Dr. Ravi Jairam in which he acknowledges that Lucy had called him to help with child K. And then there are multiple instances, I'm not going to go over all of them, I just want to talk about this briefly, in which Lucy is the first person to respond to alarm. So she raises the alarms and she responds to the alarm, as you can see here in relation to child J. And then on top of that, Lucy notes discoloration in multiple infants. So she is noting the evidence that was then used against her. She was actually the most prominent noter of discoloration on the unit, just as she was the most prominent compiler of Datex information on the unit. So you see this here in relation to child I, and here you see her noting mottling in relation to child B. So with everything that we've established in this video, I now want to read to you from this Guardian article. This is from 2018 again. Cheshire baby deaths, police widen inquiry to second hospital. So we know how exemplary the investigation was at the Liverpool Women's Hospital. So this article firstly confirms that Lucy is identified by this process of digging up the garden, and the press arrive on the scene, and then neighbours identify Lucy. But I just wanted to read what neighbours said about Lucy at that time. West Mercia Police had returned to Letby's parents, Susan and John, in Hereford, with two uniformed officers entering the property. Neighbours said they were struggling to come to terms with the arrest of the University of Chester graduate. One friend described Lucy as a professional nurse who was dedicated to her dream job and wouldn't hurt a fly. The woman, who wished to remain anonymous, said, "We're still reeling from it, to be honest. Even after sleeping on it, I think everybody around here is still in a state of shock and disbelief. Lucy was doing the job she dreamed of doing and appeared nothing but dedicated and professional. You can't imagine her hurting a fly, let alone defenceless babies." Another resident on the street, who also did not want to be named, added, "I can't add much more to what's been said already about her. I knew her when she was a little girl and she was as sweet as anything. I've seen her grow up and she seemed a lovely woman. So this news is deeply and utterly shocking. I can't fathom it. When you hear these sort of things, you always get one or two people saying, 'I thought there was something fishy about them,' but with Lucy, all you will hear is positive things." A shop worker at a store close to the family home said, "They pop in now and again and they are a very polite family. They all seem very friendly and normal. It's shocking as it's a nice area and we rarely see police around here." So all of those things collectively feed into this image of Lucy that we know about by now. No one's had a bad word to say about her. There is nothing indicating that she would do anything like this. And that it then is coupled with the fact that we know that she provably saved the lives of babies on the unit. So this third passage from the Guardian article quotes a woman who wished to remain anonymous, whose son was born at the Countess of Chester Hospital by emergency caesarean section in September 2015. So I wonder what she has to say about the Countess of Chester. My son stopped breathing after I was induced, and the negligence in the hospital was absolutely horrendous from the start. They had no staff and the care was just terrible. Some of the midwives were lovely, but the majority weren't. I ended up having a horrendous time after giving birth. My son was in the neonatal unit and I developed an infection which was due to negligence by a member of staff. We made a complaint at the time, but it was brushed under the carpet. I'm sure this is all terribly familiar to you. So this leads us into the recent scandal at the Nottingham University Hospital's NHS Trust, in which more than 500 mothers and babies suffered avoidable harm or died due to failings at a toxic hospital trust. Now, there is incredible overlap between the report on this hospital and what we know happened at the Countess of Chester Hospital. So I'm going to go through the overlap between these two. Firstly, the severe and sustained capacity pressure and overcrowding. So the Countess of Chester recorded significantly higher care days than the long-term average, with high numbers of premature babies born at 31 to 36 weeks of gestation. The frequent transfers of critically ill babies, we know this was an issue with the Countess of Chester because babies frequently had to be taken to nearby hospitals when doctors at the Countess of Chester were unable to help. Insufficient consultants to cover out of hours. So the review by the Royal College that's become infamous found severe understaffing, gaps in medical and nursing rotas, and an inability to consistently provide long-term high dependency or intensive care safely. There was a 21% shortfall in nurses between 2014 and 2015, and the unit was rated red for staffing. Another issue was insufficient emergency blood transfusions for babies with severe blood loss. Baby O suffered a life-threatening drop in haemoglobin, which was not spotted by doctors, and no transfusion was given. Of course, that's not the only instance, because the panel concluded that child E was fatally affected by a delayed blood transfusion. It's very difficult to understand why a transfusion wasn't given quickly, considering the amount of blood loss for that infant. Failures in airway management with repeated intubation attempts and preventable extubations. So, again, this hardly needs to be mentioned, but there are so many instances of failed intubations and mistakes with intubation and preventable extubations in the Lucy Letby case, and as is mentioned here, in 2014, baby Noah Robinson died after being intubated incorrectly at the Countess of Chester. Delayed escalation to senior clinicians. So again, the Royal College uncovered a pattern of insufficient senior cover and a reluctance to seek advice from consultants. Several babies died following hospital-acquired infections, including Pseudomonas and sepsis. So, obviously we know about this. The Countess of Chester's neonatal intensive care unit was colonised by Pseudomonas between 2015 and 2016. Nappy pads were stuffed into the ceiling to stop waste water dripping into the unit, and sepsis was endemic on the unit. Environments described as overcrowded and lacking adequate isolation facilities. So again, an inspection by the Care Quality Commission in February 2016 found that the Countess of Chester neonatal unit lacked storage space and resources for the care of patients who required strict infection control measures. Rooms in the unit were small, with cots placed too closely together. Failures in recognising and managing severe neonatal hypoglycemia. Several babies collapsed in the Countess of Chester with unexplained low blood sugar, which the prosecution said was because Letby had spiked feed bags with insulin, but actually it can just be due to the observable characteristics of neonates. So this led to this article, NHS Maternity Scandal Hospital Blow-by-Blow Repeat of Letby Ward, says David Davis. And so David Davis comments, it looks remarkably like what happened at the Countess of Chester. Everything from the Pseudomonas through to the lack of consultant cover to very bad airway management to the hypoglycemia issue, it's extraordinarily similar, which implies to me that this is systemic across more than two hospitals. It is so similar that this may be of wider concern, bearing in mind there have been numerous mortality spikes across the country in different neonatal units. And then Mark MacDonald commented that, in my view, this isn't just the Countess of Chester or Nottingham, it's endemic across the country. We put the NHS on a pedestal, we keep wanting to talk about it being such a good thing and how we're so proud of it, but it's not a good place and there is a broken system of care for neonates across the board. The Nottingham findings don't surprise me because it was the same at Stafford, at Bristol, at Shrewsbury, and we need to start looking at the real problems rather than trying to find scapegoats. So with everything that we've examined in this video, it's clear that the picture of what actually occurred at the Countess of Chester is so different to what has been communicated through the court process and initially through the media. The media are now doing a good job of righting these wrongs, but clearly a lot of people heard a narrative regarding the Countess of Chester and regarding Lucy Letby that is completely untenable. And what I'll say finally is that more parents are going to come forward. There's more people in discussion with regard to this. I won't say any more about that. I don't think it's fair. But we know several parents already have indicated that Lucy Letby saved the lives of their infants. Hardly consistent with a hardened serial killer.